Just before I start, I'm going to add to that prayer that every single person here hears God speak directly to them through his Holy Spirit this evening. And I just ask you to be aware of yourself as you're listening. Just be aware for what God is stressing to you, what little part of it may be just for you this evening. Because I do believe that God wants to move upon us tonight. And I do believe there'll be some people that get prayed for tonight specifically for things. So do just open up to the Spirit, whether I'm eloquent or not, whether I'm mercifully brief, as Clive always wants me to be, or not. The Spirit is here to do what he will do, and let's just let him do that tonight. Okay, so our subject at the moment is this, discipleship, which is largely about learning and following Jesus, learning from him and following him with our whole lives. And we're particularly looking at the life of Peter, the disciple, as an example of a disciple, a great disciple, and also it gives us a little bit of a look at how Jesus did discipleship, because we want to be doing it his style, really. And so I want to talk specifically tonight about Peter and what he shows us in the fact that he was a disciple who was hungry for more. And I think radical disciples are always hungry for more. And I'm always quite aware with myself, am I still hungry? I ask myself that question quite a lot. Am I still hungry after God? And right at the beginning, let's begin to challenge ourselves with that same question as we just hear a bit more. Peter was always open to being stretched, always open to having some more of what Jesus could offer. And tonight's passage is just about that, really, from Matthew 14:22 to 33. We join it immediately after the feeding of the 5,000 men and then the women and children besides. Here we are. As soon as the people were fed, Jesus told his disciples to get into their boat and to go over to the other side of the lake while he stayed behind to dismiss the people. After the crowds dispersed, Jesus went up into the hills to pray. As night fell, he was there praying alone with God. But the disciples, who were now in the middle of the lake, ran into trouble, for their boat was tossed about by the heavy winds and high seas. At about 4 a.m., Jesus came to them walking on the waves. When the disciples saw him walking on top of the water, they were terrified and screamed, "A ghost!" Then Jesus said, "Be brave and don't be afraid. I am here." Peter shouted out, "Lord, if it's really you, then have me join you on the water." "Come and join me." Also translated, "Go for it." Jesus replied. So Peter stepped out onto the water and began to walk towards Jesus. But when he realized how high the waves were, he became frightened and started to sink. "Save me, Lord," he cried out. Jesus immediately stretched out his hand and lifted him up and said, "What little faith you have, why would you let doubt win?" The very moment they stepped into the boat, the raging wind ceased. Then all the disciples crouched down before him and worshipped Jesus. They said in adoration, "You truly are the Son of God." So Peter, great disciple that he was, had a go-for-it attitude. He was willing to be stretched. He was willing to be grown. Even if there were going to be some failures along the way, he was always going to go for it. And the US President Theodore Roosevelt said this, which I think sums Peter up quite well as well. "Far better is it to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy nor suffer much, because they live in a grey twilight that knows not victory nor defeat." Peter dared do mighty things. And our passage today is one such example. And I don't know if any of you read this book. Anybody seen this book? John Ortberg. If you want to walk on the water, you've got to get out of the boat. It's quite an oldie, but a goodie. And I'm going to unashamedly borrow a couple of his points this evening. But it's seamless. You won't notice which are his and which are mine. They're all God's, aren't they? Hopefully. So, one important point that we learn from this passage is that following and living after God does not ensure we are spared the storms in life. How many of us get disappointed because we think being a Christian means you have an easy life? And it's a nonsense, isn't it? But somehow we think that we're going to be escaping life with its storms, and it's not that at all. In fact, it can be quite the opposite at times. But if we can weather them with God, they are potential times for enlargement of our faith and of our experience of God's power. And I think we do need that. So I certainly, for one, know that I need fresh experiences to grow my faith and my experience of God's power. which means sometimes I find myself in storms. And storms can be quite fearful, can't they? I mean, we're not kidding ourselves. If we're in a boat, who's watched that Deadliest Catch? We have to watch that in our house, of course. Married to a fisherman. Actually, I love that program because you see this little boat and the waves are up here and they're trawling away for these crab and all the rest of it. It's so exciting, but it's terrifying. And fishermen regularly get thrown overboard. I mean, they regularly get lost at sea. Storms are fearful things. And so fear, we have to look at the subject of fear in our lives. It's a natural human response to the thought or appearance of danger or intimidating situations beyond our control. And if it's not controlled, if the fear is not controlled, it's also a disabling, negative emotion which can result in physical immobilization, emotional or mental impairments and disorders. And what lies between the two definitions is what we do with the fear that we feel. So the main thing to remember in any stormy condition, and it was in this story as well, is that we've got to fix our eyes on Jesus rather on how high the waves are. I speak to myself here because I'm a great one at looking at how high the waves are and how strong the wind is. But we'll always sink when we do that. And Peter learned that the hard way. He focused on Jesus and he was able to walk on the storm and through the storm. And as soon as he looked at the stuff around him and how big that looked, he gave that power in his life and he began to sink under the storm. So some think that fear is the absence of faith, but I think more realistically, fear comes. But it's an opportunity to depend on God and have our faith enlarged. So I don't think we should be quite so hard on ourselves if we feel fearful at times. It's what we then do with that fear, and there's a process to go through. John Ortberg says this about fear. The fear will never go away because growth always involves going to new places and facing new challenges, and the only time it will be absent is when we've stopped growing. Disciples must therefore get used to discomfort and renounce comfort as their ultimate value and goal in life. I find that quite challenging. I don't know if you do, but I find that quite a challenging statement, although I know it's true. But we do note in this passage that Peter didn't just go gung-ho over the side and launch himself into the waters. He asked Jesus if it was a good idea. If it's you, Lord, call me to come to you. And Jesus said, go for it. And it's very important that whether we're being obedient to God's call or whether we're just having a good idea, it's very important that we wait and know that God is in it. And it can be the waiting that's quite the hard thing. But waiting on God to know that he's in that is so important, because when the storms come, we know that we can look to him and he'll see us through it. If we're not sure he's in it, then that's when we start to find those things very, very difficult. So it's worth the wait to trust him for the whole journey. There's been several significant times in Clive's and my married life where we've been asked to do something that has been deeply uncomfortable and fearful at times. And I know most of you will have heard some of those stories, but just to recollect a couple for you, and just to show you that God's call is not without concerns or challenges. God led Clive when we were not married really, to give up his very well-paid job in London and to begin our own business linked to a Christian community in Didcot. There were many ups and downs, and at one stage it looked like we might lose our home because that was a guarantor on all the monies we owed through the business. But we learned over many, many years that God is faithful. We learned that he had started something and he would finish it. And he even took us through a massive set of losses and a recession and still kept the business going. And finally it came into profit several years later. It took years, didn't it? So just an encouragement for you there. As things stabilised in Didcot, it is now, yeah. We have been in profit over some of those years. It has been 30 years of no profit. But just as it began to stabilise, God told us to move. And he led us to Southampton, where we knew no one, where our children knew no one and had no church friends. And he said that we would find the church of our dreams, which meant for me multicultural, supernatural, and children moving in the power of God alongside adults. I feel quite encouraged that we're really getting there with all of those, aren't we? So in 1993, we landed here. But the move to a new school and church was so difficult for my son Nick, who's now 32, we moved when he was 10, that he stopped actively walking with God, even though he believed God was in the move himself and he carried faith for it. And God told us when we were back in Didcot before we moved that with the children we were leaving there, and my children leaving their community, that God would give them guardian angels until they've established themselves. And I'm still waiting on that for Nick. I still believe those angels are watching out for him. He's 32 at the moment, so we're a long way on. But I believe this could be the year of fulfillment for Nick, to find his own walk of faith yet again. God's word went out, the call came, we had to respond. You have to trust, not just yourself, but all those you take with you, don't you, into that call, and it's a challenge. In 2000, God sent me kicking and screaming to Thailand, leaving notes for my family in case I didn't return, literally. I was fearful of the plight of the Burmese refugees we'd be meeting. I was fearful of the flights, the bugs, the toilets, the food, the heat. There was nothing that I wasn't scared of. But God knew that it would open up my heart, and he knew it would open up this church to the nation, and other churches too. And now, us and other churches involved in Thailand have served those vulnerable refugees for over, 17 years to date. There have been more than 30 teams that have gone out. There's many, many children sponsored, many villages empowered to stop their children being trafficked, a hostel for children built, and hundreds of village children sponsored to go to school, get an education which can turn their lives around. And in turn, the work in Thailand gave us credibility with the local council here, who then supported us to start Clear, our refugee project in Southampton. So this call, it was a small step for me maybe, it felt huge at the time, but it's had so many repercussions and so many ripples going out. And there are many city life people who have stepped out the boat, leaving well-paid jobs, comfort, security, to answer God's call to set up charities, businesses and projects, or go places that release resources or help to some of the most vulnerable in our world, or to make changes amongst the most influential for the good of others. And I was going to say then, if you ask any of them these questions, this is what they say, but I think really rather than me tell you what they'd say, I'm going to ask Dave, who's leading the meeting. You might as well come up because you're one of these people who stepped out the boat. If you haven't looked on the older Trust website, then you need to look on that and see all that it's involved in. Yeah. Well, no, you just give your answer. I'll then tell you if it's wrong, all right? So, is it comfortable or easy?
It's not comfortable and it's not easy.
Okay. Are you growing through it, and is it blessing you?
Yes and yes.
Okay. Most of the time. Is it satisfying and worth it?
Is it satisfying and worth it? The answer is it worth it? The problem is I'm never satisfied because there's always more that my heart yearns for to see changed. So is it satisfying? Yes, it is satisfying, but I have to keep pressing on and keep pressing on. Is it worth it? Absolutely. Okay. Can I make a small link to something?
Yeah.
We've got Safe Families for Children coming here. There's a notice that's been around it. And so we saw that project over 3 years ago. And the project CEO describes Southampton as a 3-year overnight success because it took us 3 years to land it in Southampton with all the changes going on. And I saw last week a video that was made, and I don't know if you've seen it on Facebook, of a child that we have helped in Southampton. It was the first child that Safe Families ever helped in Southampton. This child had nothing, right? He had no bed because he'd broken his bed. When he was asked where he slept, it was in the wet blankets and duvet over in the corner. And through Safe Families, they've been able to start to support the family. And so to me, you ask me if it's worth it, if it's satisfying, knowing that that one child is somewhere along the way, somehow we just got involved and made that happen. So So that to me is the satisfying bit, is because God sees the face of that child.
So that's a big yes then. That's a big yes. Is God faithful to his word?
Without doubt.
Okay. Does it inspire others to step out with God?
I think the answer to that is yes, it does. And I've been blessed with people coming alongside, people like Megan, that have come alongside to just say, okay, what is possible? So I think the answer is yes.
I wrote that too. All the right answers there. Very good. No previous promptings. And I think it's true that people will be inspired if they too are hungry after God. And I think it's worth noting Jesus' 3 phrases that he made in the passage we're looking at tonight. He just said 3 things during the course of that passage I read to you. He said, be brave and don't be afraid. I am here. He said, come and join me, which is literally translated, go for it. And he then said, what little faith you have, why would you let doubt win? And when Jesus said, I am here, he was using the collective name of God, the Yahweh, Jehovah name, that encapsulates his character and his attributes. And it's worth doing a study on those names if you never have, because you will understand who God is and what he does for us. And I've included it in the notes, a little study on that and a link on the notes that go with these notes for Connect Groups. So do access through the website if you'd like to look at that. So we come to the question, because this question is important for hearing Jesus' words to us tonight. Are we hungry for more? Will we risk the discomfort to respond to the greater call and blessing on our lives? I believe hunger will motivate us to respond to God's call and endure through any storms that then come our way. Hunger helps us overcome the fear and stay focused, rather than sinking under the weight of the pressures. And in this way, we can maintain a forward momentum, which benefits not just us, but all those who are looking to us. All the disciples in this passage witnessed a miracle through what Peter did when he stepped out of the boat. They saw God's presence and power in new ways, and they all grew in their worship. They all threw themselves down at the end in worship and adoration. So in this way, Peter's hunger for God and courage in stepping out catalysed the faith of many others. His success and his brief failure benefited the other disciples, and they grew in their understanding of God. And there's an important note here that even if you fail, others still learn. And you still learn. So really, there is no such thing as failure in God's kingdom. Because even when Peter went down, he understood what he needed to do next time. And all the disciples who watched it also understood what would need to happen to walk on that storm and through that storm and not under it. And I feel there's a word out here today, and I'm just going to see if it lands in anybody's heart, but I think there are some here today to whom God is saying, be brave, don't be afraid, I am with you, go for it, step out, and don't give way to doubt. And I pray that you respond to that call, those of you who know that God's talking to you about it now, because you will catalyse our corporate faith, and you'll help us break out in greater worship and adoration of Jesus, and in greater experience and breakthrough in the supernatural realm. And it's for the saving of many. So I'm just going to let you think before God in your heart, is he calling me to be one of those catalysts like Peter was? And let's not just be those who wait for someone else to step out thinking it's better to stay in the boat. Because it's worth noting what it benefited the other disciples in the story to stay in the boat. Were they free from the storm? Everybody can answer this one. Pardon? No. Were they free from fear? No. Did they have the first-hand experience of the supernatural walking on the water? No. Not the first-hand experience, the second-hand experience they had. So there wasn't a lot of benefit staying in the boat. And there was an awful lot more gained by getting out of that boat. So let's be open to hearing God for what it means for us to step out of our boat. Our boat will be that thing that pulls us away from being radical disciples, and our fear tells us what it is. So ask ourselves the question, what is it that most produces fear in me, especially when I think of leaving it behind and stepping out in faith? What is that boat for us? And this is another thing that I think God's talking about. If it's fear of failure, I believe God wants to knock that on the head. And I believe he wants to pray for people to, well, he doesn't want to pray for people. He wants to stop it. We want to pray for people. So many people fear the failure that they never allow themselves to respond. But as we see with Peter, even if we fail for a moment, he will lift us up. He will use it to bless us and others. Some of the things we've mentioned through the course of this talk and listening to Dave, etc., they've involved taking large steps, risks with God, but these were usually taken after much smaller steps had taken place. God doesn't usually just totally launch us into something without there being a journey to it and giving us some smaller steps along the way. And so maybe God's calling some of you out to deeper waters like Peter tonight, or maybe he's just asking you to take a small step. Maybe your next step is something as simple as some of these things here. Inviting someone to the Valentine's breakfast on February 12th. I'm getting all the notices done now. Getting baptized in front of your friends and family, declaring, I'm a follower of Jesus, 23rd of April. You can do that here, morning and evening. Going on an outreach on the weekend with those guys that have given themselves to doing that. Lena and Rich and others would be very happy to have you along, taking that step of faith. Maybe it's booking that healing prayer appointment. Maybe it's offering to pray for someone, Christian or not, when an obvious need arises. Maybe it's trusting God with your finances and giving your wholehearted worship in tithes and offerings. Maybe it's getting involved in serving on the soup run or becoming an Amber chaplain or being a street pastor. Maybe it's exploring fostering and adoption to give an unwanted child or a refugee a home. Whatever your step is, just want you to remember an important thing about it. Or maybe it's also going on an overseas trip to Thailand or Uganda or India, and especially Thailand, in October, near the end. Please see me if you'd like to go. But let's just remember, and God did speak these words to me before I looked them up, if you know what I mean. He just said, remember, as Neil Armstrong said when he became the first man to walk on the moon. One small step for a man can mean one giant leap for mankind. And I don't think God's being funny about that. I think he absolutely means it. If we can take one step, we can sometimes release things for many, many, many others, as Peter did. So I'm going to stop there and just say that there's lots of questions and things that you can look at in your Connect groups and your personal devotions. They're all available on the website, and I do encourage you to get serious with God over this stuff, but I'm also hoping that during the course of this evening, God's spoken to some of your hearts, and you might want to make a response to those two things that I've spoken about specifically. One is getting that fear of failure sorted out, and one is if you're being called to be a catalyst, to step out so that you can be an example and learn yourself, but be an example and encouragement of corporate faith to others.